You're welcome to this class, and we'll be looking at transporting animals part 1. And in this part, we'll be looking at the different circulatory systems and how the heart itself functions. So quickly, for the first part, syllabus content 9.1, we'll be looking at how to describe the circulatory system as a system of blood vessels. So it's a system of blood vessels that pumps blood with pumps and valves to ensure one-way flow of blood. So we should be able to look at, for the extended part, single circulatory system in fish, describe double circulation, and explain the advantages of double circulation to finish at 9.1. So we'll look at some content of 9.1 and 9.2. So simply, the circulatory system. The circulatory system is a system that is made up of blood vessels with a pump, and the pump here is usually the heart. Blood vessels with a pump. I said HEART. Blood vessels with a pump and valves to ensure one-way flow of blood. Now, the circulatory system for the extended part, now we need to look at circulation in different animals, and in this case we look at single circulation in fish. Fish have a two-chamber heart. It has a two-chamber heart and a single circulation. When you mean two-chamber, that means it is made up of just an atrium and a venous. So if you have ventricle, this atrium, ventricle, that's all, two-chamber heart. Now, what is single circulation? This means that for every one complete circuit, for every one circuit of the blood of the body, the blood passes through the heart once. So if you're asked, define single circulation is when the blood passes through the heart once. Now let's look at this fish. Now you see, this is the gills, which is a point of gas exchange in fish. So it is where oxygen gets into the blood and carbon dioxide out. Now another thing you need to know is that blood always enter into the heart through the atrium, and blood is pumped out of the heart through ventricles. Now here, the blood that comes into the atrium and goes out of the ventricles are all deoxygenated blood. That means they have low content of oxygen inside. So what happens is, as the ventricle pumps the blood in high pressure to the gills, the gas exchange takes place here, where carbon dioxide is exchanged with oxygen, and it gets transported to all other part of the body. So this part here, we carry oxygenated blood. So all this part we carry oxygenated blood, which it will deliver to capillaries cells for them to now exchange with body cells. Then once that is done, to now send it into the what? Into the atrium, which is the heart. This is the heart, which is this, made up of two chambers, atrium and ventricle. So it will pass it into the atrium, from the atrium to the ventricle. The ventricle will now send it out at a higher pressure to the gills for it to get oxygenated. So you see, this is similar to what we just explained, a single circulation in fishes. So here you see the way it moves. As the blood comes into the atrium, it is pumped out through ventricle to gills for it to get oxygenated. Then the blood in this part are all oxygenated blood, while the blood here are deoxygenated blood. So it's a single circulatory system where it passes through the heart once to make a complete circulation. Now, so we have your artery, you have ventricle, you have atrium, then you have a vein. Now, so what is done here is similar, is the same concept. In a two-chamber heart, the ventricle pumps the heart out, and the arteries are the blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart. So it pumps it out into the gills. When it gets to the gills, it gets oxygenated and is being delivered to body cells. From body cells, is being pumped out into the veins, from capillaries into veins, from veins back to atrium, atrium, ventricle, and that's all about single circulation. So let's look at double circulation now. Now, in double circulation, mammals, that's we all have a four-chamber heart and a double circulation. Now, in double circulation is when the blood passes through the heart twice. blood passes through the heart twice is double circulation. A four-chamber heart is usually in this format, four-chamber heart. So you have a right part and a left part, and the blood passes through the heart twice. Now the right side of the heart receives deoxygenated blood from the body and pumps it to the lungs. That is the pulmonary circulation. So what happens here is pulmonary circulation. Let me use P to represent pulmonary circulation. And what happens in the lower part of the body here is systematic circulation. So that's the two types. Now, if you look at the movement, this is what happens. Let me explain it a little. This heart is divided into four chambers. Let me use a more pronounced color. The heart is divided into four chambers. So, as the blood gets delivered to body cells, it comes in through the first chamber, which is the right atrium, to the right ventricle, then is pumped out through the right ventricle to the lungs, where at the lungs it gets oxygenated. From there, it comes back into the heart through the left atrium, from there to the left ventricle. The left ventricle will now pump the blood out of the heart to all other parts of the body. So it passes through the heart twice. It comes in first, get to the lungs, get oxygenated, then come back before the ventricle will now pump it out to all other parts of the body. So this circulation here involves pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein, so it's called the pulmonary circulation. While down here there's a whole lot of different arteries that we'll look at. Is called systematic circulation. So when the blood passes from the heart to the lungs is pulmonary circulation, but from the heart to the rest of the body is systematic circulation. So, and in you see the right side of the heart receive the deoxygenated blood from the body and pumps it to the lungs, while the left side of the heart, which is this, is divided in the middle here by the septum. This is the right side, this is right, and this is the left side. So the left side receives oxygenated blood because it has gone through the pass through the lungs. It's now oxygenated. It receives oxygenated blood from the lungs and pumps it to the body. That's systematic circulation. While this receives the oxygenated blood from the rest part of the body and pumps it to the lungs. That's pulmonary circulation. So what are the advantages of double circulation? It has several advantages over single circulation. Now, oxygenated blood is kept separate from deoxygenated blood, as you can see from the diagram. Deoxygenated blood here, while oxygenated blood here is separate, it doesn't mix. Now, the septum in the heart ensures this complete separation. The septum separates the two parts, the left and right part, from each other. Now, these ensure we supply our body tissues with oxygen-rich blood instead of a mixture of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Now, the blood pressure in systematic circulation is kept higher than that in the pulmonary circulation. Now, the left ventricle has a thicker wall. This is the left, remember, than a thicker wall. So the pump blood under high pressure to the body and greater flow of blood to all body tissues, while the right ventricle has a thinner wall and pumps blood only to the lungs under low pressure, thereby avoiding any form of lung damage. So pulmonary circulation is usually under a low pressure form of circulation. So take note of that. And sorry, so let's move. So now this will bring us to the heart. How does the heart function? So you can pause it and look through your content objective. Though we'll not cover all this content syllabus 9.2 because we'll also continue the same content in part 2 of this video. But we'll be able to cover from that point down to this point. So we'll start from physical activity in part 2. So we'll cover from here upwards. So you should name the structures of the heart, and we'll also look at how it functions. So quickly, heart structure. Basics. Basic. Now the heart is labeled as if it was in the chest. So what is your left on this diagram is actually your right, and vice versa in real life. So this left, if you turn it the other way to put it in your chest, it will form the right side. So take note of that while answering questions. Now, the right side of the heart receive deoxygenated blood. This right side of the heart receives deoxygenated blood from the body and pumps it to the lungs through the pulmonary arteries. Now, the left side of the heart receives oxygenated blood from the lungs and pumps it to the body. Now, blood is pumped towards the heart in veins. Blood comes to the heart, pumped towards the heart in veins, while blood is pumped towards the heart in veins and away from the heart in arteries. So you should take note of that. Blood is pumped towards the heart in veins and away from the heart in arteries. Now, the two sides of the heart are separated by a muscle called septum. Take note of that. These two sides, you see this middle here, is separated by a muscle called the septum. Now, the heart is made up of muscle tissues which are supplied with blood by the coronary arteries. Take note of that, because when we look at coronary heart disease, we'll now make reference to coronary arteries in detail. So I'll use this next diagram to explain how every content of the heart functions, because this previous diagram is too basic. There are certain features that are missing, so we'll use this next one. Now, we've been able to establish that. Let me just use the heart now in general. Now, blood comes into the heart through the veins. We've established that blood flow to the heart through the veins, and this blood will enter the heart through the right atrium. So blood comes in. You can see the direction of the arrows itself. Blood comes in through the right atrium, and the blood that comes into this right side is deoxygenated, remember, and this left side is oxygenated. So as the blood comes into the right atrium, it moves from the right atrium to the right ventricle. It will pass through the tricuspid valve, and this tricuspid valve function is to prevent the backflow of blood. So once the blood comes into the right ventricle, it cannot go back to the right atrium. Now, from the right ventricle, it is now pumped out through the pulmonary arteries. And it passes through this valve, also called the semilunar valve. And the semilunar valve major function is to prevent backflow of blood. So once the blood passes through the pulmonary arteries, it cannot come back to the right ventricle. Now, from the pulmonary arteries, the blood will now flow to the lungs. If I have my lungs here, the blood will flow to the lungs. At the lungs, the blood will now get oxygenated. That means carbon dioxide will go out during gas exchange, and oxygen will be added to the blood. So the blood will become oxygenated and will now flow back. Let me change color because to differentiate between. The blood will now flow back from the heart into the lungs, from the lungs back to the heart through what? The left atrium. So that is why they say the left part carries oxygenated blood. So as it comes into the left atrium, then the left atrium also have a valve called the bicuspid valve. Take note of these valves, please. The bicuspid valve, all their function is to prevent backflow of blood. From there, it moves into the left ventricle. So the left ventricle will now pump the blood to all other parts of the body. Now, this process, it passes out through the aorta. So this is the aorta. Why this is, it comes in through the vena cava. We'll look at this. I think I have another diagram that explains it. Through the vena cava and out of the body through the aorta. So this is simply how it functions, and this is the septum that separates the left from the right part. So oxygenated blood doesn't mix. Now, another thing you should know is the the ventricles here, which is right ventricles and left ventricles, have thicker walls. They have thicker walls. The major reason is because the both ventricles pump blood out of the heart, while the both atriums receive blood into the heart. Take note of that, because you see, the right atrium, the oxygenated blood is coming in. The left atrium, um, oxygenated blood is coming in. However, the right ventricle is pumping the oxygenated blood out of the heart, and the left ventricle is pumping oxygenated blood out of the heart. However, the left ventricle have the thickest wall. The left ventricle have the thickest wall because it needs to pump the blood out at a high pressure to all other part of the body. So the left ventricle have a thicker wall than the right ventricle. So please just take note of that. That's how the heart functions. It's as simple as that. Then extended functions of valves. Like I've stated earlier, there are two types of valves, and the major function is to prevent backflow of blood. We have the atrioventricular valve. Now it's called atrioventricular valve because it separates the atrium from the ventricle. So this is the atrium ventricle. So this valve here, let me use a different color, please. So this valve here and this valve here are both called atrioventricular valve. However, there are two types of this atrioventricular valve, and that is known as the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve. Now, the tricuspid valve separates the left part of the heart, while the bicuspid valve functions more at the right side of the heart. So you should just take note. You should be more specific because you're writing extended. These valves are pushed open when the atrium contracts and relax and the rest. So I don't think they'll ask you in much detail to explain how the valves work. I know majorly they'll just ask you, you label the part and tell them which one is tricuspid and bicuspid valve. And remember, the semilunar valves are found in two blood arteries. Is found inside the pulmonary arteries that takes the blood to the lungs, and also is found inside the the aorta that pumps blood to all other parts of the body. So quickly, let's look at the pathway of blood through the heart. Is simply to what I've explained it. I never knew I'm coming back to this. Now, like I said, you see, this is the oxygenated blood comes into the right atrium. This is from the lower part of the body. That is why it's called the inferior vena cava. This is from the upper part of the body. That's your head and the rest. So it's called the superior vena cava. So blood comes in through these 2 points into the right atrium. So from the right atrium here, the blood is pumped out through to the right ventricle. Now, pass through the tricuspid valve. From there, it moves out through the pulmonary arteries. You see, and under the pulmonary arteries, we have this is also called the pulmonary valve, which is also part of the semilunar valve. So if you from there, the pulmonary arteries will now take the blood to the lungs, like I said earlier, where it will now get oxygenated. Now, once you get oxygenated from the lungs will now send it back through the pulmonary vein. So the pulmonary veins will now receive the oxygenated blood. As it comes in, it moves to the left ventricle, pass through the mitral valve. The mitral valve is also called the bicuspid valve. From the mitral valve, it passes down to the left ventricle, which have the thickest wall because it needs to pump the blood out through the aorta. This is now the aorta to all other parts of the human body. So that's it. That's it about how the heart functions. So next video we'll now look at heart diseases and exercise.